Good evening and welcome to the Carlum Cymru live session for GCSE History. This session now will allow me and Mr Morell to go through the topics we've covered in the previous recordings and give you an opportunity to ask any questions you have. So just to recap what we've done, in session 1 I went through Unit 2 America and looked at question 4. My coverage now will be very brief in comparison with that. Then Mr Morell looked at Unit 1 Depression, War and Recovery in question 4. In session 3, I looked at Depression, War and Recovery as well, with question 5. And then Mr Morell looked at Weimar Germany and technique for question 5 in Unit 2. So this is a recap of Unit 2, the America unit. Obviously, if you do Germany, the question 4 will be exactly the same. I'll be as brief as I can with one of the topic areas. I won't have time to go through them all. And then I'll recap how to answer and approach question 4. So I've chosen to do race and religion because I know that's one my students struggle with sometimes, and that's the useful question I'm going to approach. So this is topic area 2 on the America paper. The key question is, were the 1920s a decade of religious and racial intolerance? So the first aspect of that looks at religion and the idea of religious fundamentalists, those who believe everything in the Bible Belt. So Protestants, some examples of those states can be Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky. Remember, it's important to use those key details. And one of their main arguments came about over evolution and creationism. So in Tennessee in 1925, they introduced the Butler Act, and this banned the teaching of evolution in schools. So John Scopes, a supply teacher from Tennessee, decided he was going to break that rule intentionally to see what would happen. And it was taken to court in July 1925, and that's the monkey trial. So John Scopes was fined $100. However, it was a disaster for the image of fundamentalists in the South. So that unit on religion is very small. This unit's more about race. So one example of racial intolerance you should have looked at is the treatment of Native Americans. At the start of this time period, they're placed on reservations, and reformers argue that in order to survive in modern America, they need to reject their culture and their identity. So a way of doing that is by Americanizing the children and sending them to boarding schools. The Merriam Report in 1928 showed how badly these children were treated in these schools. So again, remember a few key details. You'll never be expected to remember more than that for one aspect of this, especially with the treatment of Native Americans. Another aspect of racial intolerance in this period is the treatment of African Americans. And one aspect is the Jim Crow laws, so the laws of segregation. They could be segregated in schools, hospitals, and they were also limited in their ability to have the vote. So technically, they should have been allowed the vote. However, states put things in place to avoid that. So that could be the literacy test, the grandfather clause, violence, intimidation. And another aspect of racial intolerance is the Ku Klux Klan. Now, that's a question I'm going to have a look at with you on question 4. They revived after 1915 with the release of a film, Birth of a Nation, where the KKK was shown as heroes. Their leader was a dentist, Hiram Wesley Evans, during this period, and he was basically untouchable because a lot of politicians were worried that they would lose support if they went after the Ku Klux Klan. By 1925, they had 5 million members, which shows their power. So they wore white robes as a symbol of their white supremacy and also to conceal their identity. They burned crosses. And they were seen, what they saw themselves was WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and they disliked anyone who didn't fit that image. Then in that unit, you also have to consider the reaction to this treatment that was experienced by African Americans. And the 3 things they want you to focus on is the Great Migration between 1916 to 20, when they moved from the southern states to the northern states, and this was almost 1 million African Americans during this period. Now, there's some positives, like life expectancy increased, but it wasn't as great as they thought it would be. So in 1919, race riots broke out in Chicago, and they still experience poor treatment. often the last to be hired and the first to be fired. They also joined new organisations like the NAACP, which was set up in 1909. The leader was Webb Du Bois, and his aim was to bring about change through battling through the courts, so using non-violent methods, peaceful methods. And then the opposite end of that is a different organisation, the UNIA, led by Marcus Garvey, and they were more militant. Okay, so that covers very briefly the things I discussed previously with you in the first session. So I have got a question there. I did change it. So I've changed the question for you, just so you can see another example. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to read through that. Obviously, if that's not long enough, you can pause. So if we start thinking about this question then, so you will always get two sources, and you will be asked which one is more useful to an historian studying a certain topic. Now, it's important that you acknowledge that all the sources the WJC give you will be useful to a certain extent. They're never going to give you anything that's completely off topic, so you will have to acknowledge the usefulness of both sources, okay? But however, remember, you can say that one is more useful than the other, okay? So you also have to be clear about the topic. So don't just say, oh, these are useful, these are useful. Be clear why they're useful, to what? To an historian studying that particular topic. That's key. Okay, so by the end of your answer, your response, I tell my students to spend either 15 minutes or 20 minutes on this question, and I would expect them to have a paragraph about why source C is useful to an historian studying the topic, why source D is useful to an historian studying the topic, and then a conclusion, reaching a judgment, deciding which one is more useful. Okay, so I previously mentioned the mark scheme. There are 6 marks for detailed own knowledge. And by detailed own knowledge, I mean naming places, naming dates, key events, key figures. Okay. Now, a lot of my students sometimes forget that that is an important aspect of it. They become brilliant at analysing the usefulness of the source. However, they forget that you do need to consider some own knowledge within that response for historical context. Okay. And I would expect at least 4 key details, those names, those places, when they're analysing both sources. Okay, and when analysing the sources, it's important you consider what the source tells us and why that is useful to an historian studying the topic. Think about who produced it, when it was produced. When is often a good opportunity to work in that historical context and own knowledge. That shows you know what you're talking about. Also, consider the nature of the source. What type of source is it? How does this impact the usefulness? Is it a speech? Is it a newspaper article? That will allow you to comment on how useful the source is. The purpose, why it was made. Okay, I know that's more important in question 3, but you still need to consider that. And finally, one that the top responses should have is audience. Who is meant to read it? Who is that aimed at? Okay, and that would be something you consider with both of the sources. Okay, that will allow you to analyze the content, the authorship, and produce a clear and well-supported judgment. Okay, now back to the sources then. If you look at source C, obviously you can talk about the content of the source, but it's important that you don't forget to discuss that authorship. Okay, so a lot of my students, when I've done this question, have said, oh, well, no, it's not reliable, it's not useful because it's from the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, Hiram Wesley Evans. But that doesn't mean it's not useful. Okay, it is still useful to an historian studying the KKK because it gives us the perspective of those who are part of the Ku Klux Klan. So consider who made it. Hiram Wesley Evans. How does that impact the usefulness? What type of source is it? The nature. Now, it's a speech. and it's aimed at a meeting of members of the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, that's important that you mention that. Also consider then that it was released in 1925. We know at that point that they had around 5 million members. That then is detailed knowledge as well. Okay, it's at the height of the Ku Klux Klan. So you would address all those things to consider the usefulness of that source. So I put there, the content is the information it gives us, what it tells us, and don't waste too much time on that, okay? 1 or 2 things are more than enough. You get up into the higher marks for considering the authorship of that source and consider how it impacts usefulness, okay? And exactly the same, remember to work in detailed historical knowledge. It's worth 6 marks in this question. Okay, you can do the best analysis ever, but if you forget the knowledge, you can still only get 6 out of 12 marks. Again, you do exactly the same with the next source. Think about what it tells us, why that's useful to an historian studying the topic, and also consider the authorship again. Again, we have to work in detailed knowledge that's relevant to that source. Finally, you reach a judgment on which source is more useful. Now, there's no new reasons. You summarize the key points. Again, use the content and authorship to give these reasons. Okay, compare them. Okay, if you're going to say source C is more useful, why is it more useful than source D? Okay, why is source D limited in comparison with source C? Okay, so that is my first session. Then if you go back to session 1, you'll see all of that in more detail. Session 3 then looked at Unit 1, Depression, War and Recovery, which Mr. Morell is also going to cover. I looked at rebuilding the country after 1945, and specifically question 5. Okay, again, what I've done with that unit, because I've already covered it in the session, I've summarized the key information. Okay, so the key question for rebuilding the country after 1945 is, how did the Labour government deal with the problems of the time? Okay, and one of the reasons they came to power is because they promised to deal with the problems outlined in the Beveridge report. So these 5 giants: so want, squalor, disease, idleness and ignorance. And when answering this question, think about the things that they introduce that would deal with those. For example, what would deal with the disease? And they introduced the National Health Service. Okay, that is in operation from 1948. Okay, it provides free healthcare to all. The health minister at the time is Aneurin Bevan from Tredegar. He did face a lot of opposition from doctors at first because they were concerned they were going to lose money. However, when he said they will be able to work in their own time in private practice, they agreed to support the NHS. Now, for each of these policies, consider the positives and the negatives. Now, I've said they're 500 billion, that's 500 million, sorry, in the first year. Okay, that is a massive problem with each of these. They cost too much. However, life expectancy does increase. The rate of contagious diseases decreases. Okay, and surely providing free healthcare for people who might not have previously been able to afford it is a positive. Okay, they also introduced the Education Act. This provides free secondary education to children up to the age of 15. It's split into 3 stages: primary, secondary and further. Okay, to decide what type of school you went to in the secondary phase, you'd sit an 11+. And I'm sure your teachers have had a go of that with you, and you can see it's a very difficult test. Okay, especially if you're sitting at the age of 10 or 11. Okay, if you did really well, you'd go to a grammar school. And if not, you go to a secondary modern school or technical, and there weren't many technical schools built. Now, the thing to think about is it's deciding a child's future at a very early age. So that is a criticism of it. However, remember, it provided free education for all children up to 15. Okay. Another problem outlined in the Beveridge report was squalor. Okay, poor housing. So they introduced the Homes for All policy. By the end of 1951, they had built 800,000 houses. However, that wasn't enough to cover the number needed. Okay, they also introduced the New Towns Act. So Welsh example of that is Cwmbran. And finally, they introduced nationalisation. Okay, and this would deal with idleness to make sure people are in work. Okay, so key industries like coal, railways, electricity would now, rather than be owned by private industries, would be owned by the state. Now, compensation had to be paid out to the owners of these industries. Okay, so again, a positive, it keeps people in work. No matter how bad the industry is doing, the government will keep them going. 1 in 10 British people worked in these industries. Okay, also output increases in several industries like coal. However, again, remember the one aspect that is a problem throughout is that it's extremely expensive. Okay, so now I'm going to look at question 5. So take 30 seconds to read through that. Again, if you're unsure about getting through it in 30 seconds, you pause the video. So question 5 then, it looks at a certain interpretation about an issue related to the course. Now, what I've done there is written down some common problems that my students in Newport face, okay? And a lot of the time they forget about adding in that detailed historical knowledge, okay? They clearly understand the topic, however, they forget to add those details, okay? Like names. If you're talking about the NHS, working in Iron Bevan, dates, places, okay? Cwmbran would be a place that we mentioned, figures or historical terms, okay? Like nationalisation, okay? That is a very subject specific, it shows that you know your stuff, okay? The beverage report, that is subject specific and shows you know your stuff, okay? Outline those 5 giants. If you notice in the source that they only mentioned 2 of them, then you were going to add the others in to show you do know it, okay? Another common issue is that students forget to identify the interpretation in the source, okay? Straight away, clearly identify that interpretation, okay? And what I say, all that means is the view outlined in that source, okay? Someone's opinion about it. Often my students argue over who's the greatest footballer. Is it Ronaldo or is it Messi? They split the class, that's their interpretation. As long as they've got support to back that up, then you can argue against them, but you can't say they're completely wrong, okay? You also need to identify a different interpretation to that one in the source, okay? And finally, it's important that you mention the authorship and why they would reach their interpretation. You can also consider how reliable that interpretation is. Now, you'll often find with these, they don't cover the bigger picture, okay? They don't cover all aspects. They just focus on one element, okay? And use these to then reach a judgment on the question. How far do you agree with the interpretation? Okay, if you agree with it, why is there a different interpretation? Still consider it. Okay, so you could agree with it to a certain extent. I tell my students to give a balanced response. Why would some people agree with it? And then why would some people disagree? Okay, so like I said, this is how far would you agree with this interpretation about the impact of the post-war Labour government in the years 1945 to 51. Okay, so again, we need to demonstrate very detailed knowledge. Okay, so it's important to consider those places, those names, those dates. Okay, then for AO4, which is worth 12 marks, you need to evaluate and analyze how and why interpretations differ. Okay, and reach a judgment. Okay, by identifying that interpretation in the source and a different one, you're considering how it's been interpreted differently. If you consider the authorship, you were considering why it's been interpreted differently. Okay, now, again, what I mentioned previously, these are the things we need to consider. What the source tells us, who produced it, when, what type of source it is, the purpose, So why it was produced, and also the audience could influence the interpretation. Who was meant to read it? So I put the 5 steps I give my students. Okay, when they answer this question, straight away I'd expect them to identify the interpretation, the source. Okay, so that's the content. Say some things about it. What does it tell us? Okay, then you discuss detailed historical knowledge which supports the view. Okay, clearly this source suggests that the Labour government failed. So you would need to use historical knowledge that supports that view. Okay, think about how expensive it is. Okay, think about how they had to bring in dental charges at the end of the time period because the NHS was too expensive. Okay, then you think about the authorship, the provenance of the source. Use different parts of it to think, well, why would they reach this interpretation? Who made it? So Winston Churchill would reach his interpretation because he's a Conservative politician. Okay, he lost his position because Clement Attlee became Prime Minister in 1945. Okay, it's unlikely that he is going to be positive about a Labour government. Okay, and it's a Conservative newspaper. When you're considering the different interpretation that life was actually good under the Labour government from 1945 to 51, you would then consider key details about arguments why it was not that bad, why it was a success, and then think about why different people would reach that interpretation. Okay, they would reach that interpretation by not just focusing on the bad things like Winston Churchill did, they would consider the positives. Okay, and then finally reach a judgment answering that question. And in that judgment, it's an opportunity for you to show how it's been interpreted differently, so the 2 different interpretations, and why. Give an overview of that and decide whether you agree or not, giving reasons. Okay, now in the previous session, I went through a model answer with you as well. So if you want to see that in more detail, I think I'm just about running out of my time now. So in your own time, you can go back through that and have a look at that model answer. So I hope that that's covered everything. I know it's brief, but only in 20 minutes. That's all I could do for 2 40-minute sessions. I'm now going to pass over to Mr. And I've stopped sharing, and you can see his PowerPoint. And
thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Face on there yet, sir?
My face isn't quite yet, but I'll figure it out.
Brilliant.
Here we go. I think I've got it, potentially. Right. Maybe not.
If you click the 2 panels on the side, have you seen those ones?
Yeah.
I've gone back to single source now, so you should work on there.
My face is there. I don't know. Don't worry. I'll
let you have,
I'll let you have a fiddle so while I start my.
Brilliant.
My
thank you, sir.
So thank you very much, Mr. Dagton, for that. Really useful, really helpful for you guys. My sections, as you'll have seen, covered both one section of dream transition and another section of depression war and recovery. What I want to do is just start by inviting any questions you guys have got at all. So if you've got any questions, whether it's based on what the sessions, what you've seen in the sessions I've done, or whether it's in response to any of the questions I go through now, then don't hesitate to put them in that chat, and Mr. Dagton will ask them to me, and I'll do my best to answer them. So my first session was on depression, war and recovery, and we looked specifically at the key question, one of those 7 key questions in depression, war and recovery, which was how effectively did Britain prepare for war? So what I thought I'd do is, well, as part of that session is, we did some various activities at the end of each kind of sub content, and some of those activities included a questionnaire or kind of a mini quiz. So what I thought I would do is I would just repeat that. I'd just repeat those questions because the more familiar you are with those questions and the more easily it is that you can recall that knowledge, the more easily you will access those AO1 marks that Mr. Dagton was talking about, demonstrating the knowledge that you've got. So what we're going to do is we're going to have questions, right? And every question is going to have 3 answers. So what I suggest you do is you just allocate the top one as A, middle one as B, and the bottom one as C. And just jot down, all you need to do is jot down A, B, or C, to be honest, and then you can tally them up as you go and get an idea of how well you're doing. And then what it might do is it might identify a certain area within this key question that you could build on. You could go back over and revise and revisit again in order to enhance your knowledge, in order to make sure you've absolutely nailed that knowledge, ready to get all those marks you can do in the exam. So just I don't know, piece of paper anywhere, scrap paper, anything like that, right? Just get ready to write A, B, or C, and we'll tally up the scores as we go along, just to see how we're getting on. So the third question, when we're thinking about as our key topic is, how effectively did Britain prepare for war? Our first question is that many people thought that there would never be another world war after the end of World War I. But what was it that changed everything? Was it A, the Russian Revolution? Was it B, the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party? Or was it C, German punishment after World War I? Just writing down A, B, or C, and then in a minute I'll tell you what the answer is, and you can self-mark it then and see if you're right. Question 2. Which treaty would Hitler have to break if he was to make Germany a military power again? Was it the Treaty of Rappalling? Was it B, the Locarno Treaty? Or was it C, the Treaty of Versailles? So again, write A, B, or C down, and we'll mark it in a minute. Question 3. What did Hitler restart in 1935? So obviously after he's come back into power in 1933. What did he restart? Did he restart construction and rearmament, conscription and rearmament, or conscription and disarmament? Think about the meaning of some of those words in order to help you with that answer. A, construction and rearmament, B, conscription and rearmament, C, conscription and disarmament. Question 4. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement stated that the German Navy could be how large? Was it A, 75% the size of the Royal Navy? Was it B, 50% the size of the Royal Navy, so half the size of the Royal Navy? Or was it C, 35% the size of the Royal Navy, so much smaller than the Royal Navy? So making sure you've written down your A, B, or C, and we'll see what the answers are now. So question 1, the answer is, of course, B, the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Russian Revolution, of course, in 1917. I say, of course, you might have no idea about that. I teach it. You might have never learned about it, so don't worry about that, right? But Russian Revolution was 1917. German punishment after World War I, yeah, maybe that feeds into it, but you've seen the Weimar Republic in that time, and so not necessarily that leading directly to war. Question 2 was C, the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Rappalling didn't apply to Germany. The Locarno Treaty was an international treaty signed between lots of different countries. It was the Treaty of Versailles that was focused specifically on Germany. Question 3, conscription and rearmament. Conscription and rearmament. Conscription, men being forced to join the army. Rearmament, rebuilding weapons, tanks, guns in order to fight the war as best you can. So obviously not disarmament, which would be opposite, which would be getting rid of weapons, selling them, destroying them, whatever. Question 4 then is 35% the size of the Royal Navy. So they agreed to let Germany have a navy, which was more than the Treaty of Versailles would have let them, but not a very big one at all. 35% the size of the Royal Navy, about a third the size of the Royal Navy, so fairly small. So hopefully you're getting the pattern then. You're writing A, B, or C down, and the same then as we go through more questions. Just testing your knowledge, factual recall, making sure you've got it on the tip of your tongue, because when you get into that pressurized system or environment, that's what I'm looking for, environment of the exam, then you'll have these at the tip of your tongue, and good factual recall will help speed up your answers to your exams as well, which is tough in the hour that you've got. So question 1, where did Germany remilitarize in 1936? Was it A, the Saar, B, the Ruhr, or C, the Rhineland? Question 2. In 1938, the Anschluss took place. This was the union of Germany and which other country? Was it A, Austria, B, Belgium, or C, Switzerland? Question 3. In 1938, where did a crisis arise after Hitler encouraged German-speaking people to demand their independence? Was it A, Bohemia, B, Slovakia, or C, Sudetenland? Now this one's a bit tricky. I've thrown an answer in there that might throw you off, so be really careful. Take a second just to make sure you've got the right answer before writing A, B, or C down. And question 4. At which conference was the union of Germany and the Sudetenland permitted by Britain, France, and Italy? By union, I mean joining together. In which conference was it permitted? Was it the Munich Conference, the Berlin Conference, or the Stuttgart Conference? A, Munich, B, Berlin, C, Stuttgart. So again, we'll have a look at the answers. Mark your answer then, right? Give it a tick if you got it right, and then you can tally up and you can see what rough score you've got, and that'll inform then where it is you could focus a bit more of your revision, a bit more of your factual recall. So question 1, it was the Rhineland. So the Ruhr, an area of Germany, so you might have got it confused with that, but it's the Rhineland that was demilitarized as part of the Treaty of Versailles, and so it was there that could be remilitarized. Question 2, it was Austria. The union was Germany and Austria. Again, another speaking German country, just like Germany as well. In 1938, the crisis arose in the Sudetenland. Now, this is always one that people get mixed up because the Sudetenland was part of Czechoslovakia. So people often think, oh, it must be Slovakia, but it's not. Sudetenland, which is another area, an area of the present-day Czech Republic. So be clear that it's the Sudetenland there and not Slovakia. It was a tough one. I threw in a tough one there just to keep you on your toes. Question 4, it was the Munich Conference, where Britain, France, and Italy agreed to let Germany have the Sudetenland. The Munich Conference. Our next set of questions then, again, hopefully you've got that pattern, A, B, or C, that's all you need to write down. Question 1, Hitler's invasion of which country in March 1939 finally showed Britain that Hitler could not be trusted? Was it A, Poland, B, Austria, or C, Czechoslovakia? Again, a tricky one here, because overall, ultimately, Hitler did take all of these countries, but which one was it that finally showed Britain that Hitler couldn't be trusted in March 1939? Question 2. Nazi Germany surprised the world by signing a treaty with which country in August 1939? Was it A, France, B, Poland, or C, the USSR? Question 3. Britain and France declared war against Germany on the 3rd of September 1939 after the invasion of which country? Was it A, France, B, Czechoslovakia, or C, Poland? Some tricky questions here because lots of these countries, again, in terms of invasion, right? All 3 of these countries were essentially invaded at some point, but it's just getting that order right, making sure you know which one happened when, which one happened first, second, third, etc. So let's go through our answers and make sure we're doing all right and we've got that factual recall. So the first one, it was the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1939 that showed Britain that Hitler couldn't be trusted anymore. Hitler had promised Prime Minister Chamberlain, not President, apologies, Prime Minister Chamberlain, he promised him that he wouldn't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia in that Munich conference. But yet in March 1939, he did invade the rest of that country. Now, Austria, as we saw in the previous slide, previous questions, was taken by Germany, was joined together with Germany, so I can see why you might have answered that, but that was before March 1939. Poland, again, was ultimately invaded, but that was later than March 1939, and so it's not quite that one. Second question, it was the USSR. The USSR, who are communist, a communist country, so of course it took the world by surprise when the Nazis in Germany hated the communists. Why would they be signing a peace treaty with these guys? Question 3 then, the answer is Poland. Again, all of these countries were invaded or partly invaded by the Nazis at some point. France during the Second World War itself, or part of France. Czechoslovakia, as we saw before, was March 1939. It was Poland in September 1939 that sparked that was the final spark that caused the Second World War. Okay, so in terms of preparation on the home front, question 1, when was the first conscription law of World War II made? Was it A, April 1939, B, August 1939, or C, September 1939? All in 1939, so you've got to be a bit more specific than just the year. Question 2, how many men had been conscripted into the British Army by December 1939? A, 1 million, B, 1.5 million, or C, 2.5 million? Again, all plausible figures. And this is where specific figures, that factual recall will help you in the exam. The more accurate you are, the more likely you are to pick up those AO1 marks. Question 3, what was not initially included as a reserved occupation, as an occupation that they didn't take men from to join the army? A, coal miners, B, railway workers, or C, farmers? So, answers. When was the first conscription law of World War II made? It was April 1939. It was made quite a long time before the war. It was made just after that invasion of Czechoslovakia, where they finally realized they couldn't trust them anymore. It was very limited in terms of the people that conscripted. I believe it was men aged 18 to 21 and single men only. So very, very limited. It was extended in August, September 1939, but the initial one was April 1939. Question 2, how many men had been conscripted? It was 1.5 million. Right, huge number. If we think the main conscription law was September 1939, in 3 months, really, they managed to conscript 1.5 million people. And the last one was coal miners, a little bit strangely, because coal is needed, isn't it, to power the navy, things like that, to power the factories making the weapons. But initially, coal miners were not a reserved occupation. As you probably have seen in your study as well, what eventually happened is we had these things called Bevin boys, where 1 in 10 of the conscripts were sent to the coal mines because they realised how important they were in the end. But at first, they were not conscript. They were not a reserved occupation, and they were conscripted. So that brings me to the end of the little quiz on that. What I wanted to do was just to remind you about using this content. So it's all well and good, isn't it? Understanding the content, knowing those cold, hard facts. But when it comes to revision, you need to also be able to make sure that you can use it. Because in the exam, essentially what they're going to do is, other than the describe question, they're not going to ask you just to recall information. Good recall of information is the basis on which you will then build on the other skills that you have to use in the exam in terms of source analysis, in terms of arguing a point as to how significant something was, things like that. So in the actual session that we did, I recorded online, what I asked you to do was to think about making a judgment on each of these sub-elements of the key question, how effectively did Britain prepare for war, in order to show that you use the content and you can recall it to then use it and give it some sort of form. So the first one was threat from Germany, right? So if we're thinking overall, how effectively did Britain prepare for war? Well, we could say, well, the threat from Germany meant Britain was not prepared at all. Or we could say the total other end of the spectrum is that as a result of the threat from Germany, Britain was very effectively prepared for war. Now, if it was me, I'd be not going too far up. I'd be saying that the threat from Germany began to make people aware that maybe we needed to be a bit more prepared for war, but it didn't actively spark anything. Maybe the best thing it sparked was in April 1939, that first conscription law. Britain's policy of appeasement. I would be controversial, I know, particularly given most recent historians, but I'd be saying actually it helped Britain very effectively prepare for war. It bought them time to introduce conscription. It bought them time to prepare, whether it's on the home front or whether it's military equipment as well. Preparations for war, those specific preparations for war, like the air raid warnings, like the radar balloons, right? Or sorry, like the radar and the barrage balloons. I would say a middling. Now, the reason I'd say middling is because in 1939, when the war began, actually very little of it was on the home front. A lot of it was on the continent. So actually these things to prepare Britain back at home weren't necessarily effectively preparing for Britain for that kind of war. Very quickly it did move to the Blitz and things like that, in which these preparations were needed, but that could have happened over a longer period of time than, say, appeasement, which was building up the military forces. And conscription and reserved occupations, that central government organisation, I'd go pretty high. There wasn't the kind of dilly-dallying, right, as you might call it in the First World War, of volunteer armies, waiting for people to sign up, persuading people to sign up. It was straight from the off, we need men to join the army, get in the army, and we also know that there are certain jobs we need to keep people in order to ensure that we are not starving on the home front, or we aren't able to move troops and materials across the country on a railway network. So what I've said there is I've justified my judgment on how effectively that prepared for war is what I'd be putting in that detailed explanation box to justify my thoughts on it and to show that I've truly understand the information and it's not just recalling it, although that recall is really important. So the second session I did was on Germany in transition, right, on the specific key question of that as to how and why the Weimar Republic collapsed between 1929 and 1933. So they do the same thing. Quick quiz, make sure our factual recall is good, and then we'll look back at those judgments in order to make sure we've used this information as well. So, question 1, which event was a trigger for the global economic depression in the 1930s? Was it A, the American loans, B, the Wall Street crash, or C, unemployment? Jotting down A, B, or C. Question 2, why did President Hindenburg use Article 48 in 1930? Was it A, to stop Hitler becoming Chancellor, B, to pass laws by decree without having to go to the Reichstag, or was it C, to increase unemployment pay? Jotting down A, B, or C. Question 3, how many seats did the Nazis gain in the Reichstag between the elections in 1928 to July 1932? So, question 1, the answer is, of course, the Wall Street crash. The Wall Street crash is what led to the American loans being called in, but it was the Wall Street crash that was that trigger event. Question 2 is B, to pass laws by decree, to bypass the Reichstag. And question 3 is A. Between 1928 and July 1932, the Nazis went up from 12 seats in the Reichstag to 230 in 4 years. It is a phenomenal rise in the number of seats and a phenomenal testament to the electoral success that these guys had. Next questions. Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, translated as My Struggle, was written while he was where? A, Landsberg prison, B, in Austria, or C, during house arrest? Question 2, the NSDAP, the official name of the Nazi Party, became the biggest Reichstag party following what election? May 1928, September 1930, or July 1932? Question 3. In 1932, Hitler stood to be president, winning 11.3 million votes. But who won 18.6 million votes? Was it A, Goebbels, B, von Hindenburg, or C, Stresemann? Well, question 1, Landsberg prison is where he wrote it. Landsberg prison, where he was sentenced following his failed beer hall putsch. Question 2, it was July 1932. So it was, it was still 3 years after the Wall Street crash that the Nazis became the biggest party. So it did still take a little bit of time for them to tap into the votes of people who were unemployed, made destitute by the Wall Street crash. And question 3, it was von Hindenburg, that famous World War I general. He beat Hitler in that election in 1932 to be president. Next then, what was the SA's main role? Was it A, to forge elections, B, to act as protection for the Nazis, or was it C, to police Germany? Question 2, who was the leader of the SA? Was it A, Adolf Hitler, B, Joseph Goebbels, or C, Ernst Röhm? Question 1, the answer is to act as protection for the Nazis. They were their brutal force, right? They're out on the street, the brawn behind them. Question 2, the leader was Ernst Röhm. Some people might say surely it's not Adolf Hitler, or surely it is Adolf Hitler. Well, Adolf Hitler was the leader of the Nazis. Ernst Röhm was the leader of the specific wing of the Nazis, which was the SA. A few more questions. The Volksgemeinschaft was one of 3 main themes of Nazi propaganda. What does it mean? Does it mean A, self-sufficient Germany, B, work for the people, or C, a people's community? Question 2, who succeeded Franz von Papen as Chancellor of Germany? A, Heinrich Brüning, B, Kurt von Schleicher, or C, Adolf Hitler? Question 3, when did Adolf Hitler become Chancellor of Germany? November 1932, December 1932, or January 1933? Hopefully in your head you've got the year, and that'll help you with that answer. So question 1, Volksgemeinschaft means a people's community. Kurt von Schleicher succeeded Franz von Papen as Chancellor. And C, January 1933 is when Hitler became Chancellor. 1933 is a date you've definitely got to remember, that we can say the Weimar Republic collapsed and Adolf Hitler took over as Chancellor. So very lastly, just again, the same thing. To prove you've understood this, to prove you've understood anything, is to be able to teach it, to be able to use it. So our key question, how and why did the Weimar Republic collapse between 1929 and 1933? We need to turn it into a question which got a range of answers, from not to blame at all through to the other end of the spectrum, hugely to blame for collapse. So the Depression, I would frankly be putting it as high as I possibly could, because what people do is, if they can put food on the table and keep a roof over their head, they have got something to lose, and therefore they are not looking to the extremes. The moment they can't put food on the table and they don't have a roof over their head, that is when they have nothing to lose, and that is when they turn to the extremes, like the Nazis, and move away from that middle option, which was the Weimar Republic. Growing Nazi support, I'd say fairly high, but not quite as high as the Depression. Yes, they were able to tap into the Depression, but without the Depression, I don't think their support would have grown as quickly. People wouldn't have turned to those extremes. Role of the SA, I'd put minimal. To some extent, it did, because it showed that they were a powerful organisation. To some people, it gave them a sense of pride, right, of an organisation to be proud of, right? Obviously not to everyone, but to some people. But I don't think it was a real reason for Nazi success, which ultimately led to the end of the Weimar Republic. Propaganda, I'd say pretty big. And for every wrong the Nazis did, there's no taking away from that at all. But they did successfully manipulate what people were thinking. They did successfully create propaganda that stuck in people's minds. Arbeit und Brot is the best example, I think. Work and bread. Scheming and extremism, to some extent, right? It made people think, well, Weimar Republic is collapsing anyway, so why not turn to an extreme? But without the Depression, without the use of propaganda by the Nazis to tap into that, I don't think it would really have that much of an impact, because they could have got themselves back on an even keel. They could have steadied themselves out again. So again, what I said before, what I said in my explanation as to why I put that is what I'll be putting in the detailed explanation. And that becomes proof that you've understood this material and you can deploy it and use it in an exam scenario, particularly with this question 5. The usefulness of this sits with question 5, where you've ultimately got to create an argument as to whether or not something did or didn't cause something else, etc., etc. So hopefully that has brought together what we've seen. It's improved your factual recall and proved to you that you do know something, even if you think you don't. So thank you very much for using these resources that me and Mr. Doughton have shared with you, and the tips to succeed at History GCSE. And I know they're a few months off yet, but when they do come, I wish you all the very, very best in those exams. And I think that's it, Mr. Doughton.